আমরা সবাই একটু ক্যামেরাটা থাকবো সামনে।
কি ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংকের কেউ আসেনি?
সাদা দেখছি না।
সাধারণ একজন আসে, আর টিফার থেকে উনি এসেছিলেন। And he's কোশ্চেন কি হবে? আচ্ছা, Q&A, the question answer section. খুশি সময় পাওয়া গেছে।
তাদের স্যারের চয়েস। ভাই শুরু করতে
রমাদান করিম। Welcome to all of you. And thank you for taking the time on these very difficult days, very challenging days, and globally as well as domestic. We have a new government in charge, and the new government is already facing challenges, mountain-sized challenges, I would say. They're not just ordinary challenges. So coping with these challenges would be big challenge in itself. So we wish the new government all the best, and Policy Research Institute is always present, and we keep doing the research, the policy research that is necessary to support policy making at the highest level. And for the past 16 years, we've done that. And I understand that our contributions have been recognized. Although, so we will continue this process, and we have good teams in-house as well as our partners around town. So that is our best resource available. So thank you very much again, and I welcome you for taking the time to come and share with us your views about the state of the economy and the economy being based. We have brought with us today Mr. Mohammad Hatem, who is the president of the Bangladesh Knitwear Exporters Association, BKMEA. We have been bringing or inviting private sector leaders in the last few of our sessions. And so we are really fortunate to have Mr. Hatem today. Mr. Hatem has been in this business of export of knitwear garments. As we know, knitwear garment exports make up 56% of our total garment exports. So they are the larger, and not only that, knitwear also has the local content, which is significantly higher than the woven garment section. Rough estimate tells us that from some 80% of knitwear garment exports have locally sourced. So the value addition part, domestic value addition part in knitwear is significantly high. So sometimes the rules of origin problems that we face in several agreements, like EEA or new agreements like the Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan, and some more agreements that are coming up. All of these, knitwear is in a better position compared to the woven garment sector, which has to import roughly 60% of their inputs from abroad. Well, that is not necessarily a big problem because after all, we are exporting manufacturers. When we export manufacturing products, importing inputs from the world is part of that manufacturing exercise. So you just can't rely on domestic sourcing all the time. So, but you have to have a trade regime that is really seamless. That is the important part. So if you have a trade regime that is highly restrictive, then sourcing from abroad is going to be a problem, which is why then you start relying more on domestic sourcing, and sometimes that is not necessarily very competitive. So that is something that. So Mr. Hatem has been at the top of this, organization, BKMEA, and he was the first person who identified in some 3 or 4 years ago that our export figures, they were out of line, completely out of line. And he pointed out that it couldn't be possible that we have been exporting $5 billion a month. So, and that's when everybody started looking at the numbers carefully, and there was an IMF balance affairs mission that came and reviewed numbers, and finally they realized that export figures were at least $10 to $15 billion less. So that's the number that we are now dealing with. Our last export figures for 2025 is $49 billion, of which 81% is. That's how looking, and Mr. Hatem knows exactly where the shoe pinches, and he will share with us his ideas. And so thank you. That was my introduction to our chief guest. I now pass it on to Dr. Sadiq, who will not only moderate this event, but he will also make the opening remarks. And these opening remarks are, I want you to really follow. Dr. Sadiq is a leading macroeconomist of the country. He used to be the chief economist for South Asia region for the World Bank, and he was country director in Pakistan, Afghanistan. So, Dr. He is no small fry, okay? Dr. Sadiq has been with us and he's one of our trustees of the PRI, so we go back a long time. So, Dr. Sadiq, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Zaidi, for your very gracious introduction. Chief guest, Mr. Mohammad Hatem, distinguished participants, salam and a very good morning. Following 2 years of external sector instability, signs of recovery emerged in fiscal year 25. As exchange rates stabilized, current account deficit fell substantially and reserves recovered modestly. This was facilitated by an encouraging recovery in exports, which grew by 7% in fiscal year 25, a reduction in imports, and a surge in remittances. The capital account also improved as private and public capital inflows recovered. The external outlook became difficult in fiscal year 26 as exports declined by 3% in the first 8 months. There was a rapid accumulation of external debt and debt service grew. Remittances continued to grow at a fast pace and net capital flows remained positive. But the overall stability of the balance payment has been very fragile. The rapid decline in GDP growth and investment caused import growth to be subdued. Now that we have a new government in power, the outlook for a recovery of investment and GDP growth has improved. Of course, we require policy changes to support this. This recovery of GDP growth and investment will boost imports, no question that. So a key policy question facing the new government is where will the financing, external financing, come from to finance the associated growth in imports? Predictions that we have done as a PRI shows that imports will need to grow by at least 8 to 10% per year to support a GDP growth of 6 to 7%. Debt servicing is also increasing at a relatively fast pace. Both will require additional new financing. remittances cannot be expected to grow at their present level over the medium term, and it will likely stabilize at the trend growth rate of 5 to 6% per year. So the main source of import financing will have to be a double-digit expansion of exports. A double-digit expansion of exports calls for the emergence of a diversified export base that requires a competitive exchange rate, low inflation, sharp reduction in trade protection, improvement in trade logistics, adequate flow of FDI, and an improved skills base. The million-dollar question is Bangladesh ready for this? The outlook for exports is clouded by several uncertainties, including the recent decline of exports in European Union markets, effects of the India-US free trade agreement, the uncertainties in the USA over tariffs, the pending LDC graduation, and the most recent external shock emerging from the Iran war. The Iran war, I dare say, if prolonged, will be a game changer, as it severely threatens Bangladesh energy security that will not only disrupt the external sector, but hurt the overall economy very badly. You already see long lines get gasoline for your car. I couldn't get it for the last 3 days. The MMI focuses on the emerging threats and uncertainties, right? I think that's a very timely thing to do. While it is too early to be definitive about the impact of the Iran war, the MMI systematically explores the various sources of threat to the external economy and identifies possible policy responses. As usual, it also provides an update on the macro. Against that background, I'll invite Dr. Ashikur Rahman to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
presentation পরে আমি ওই external sector কিছু
If we can have the presentation on. Thank you. Thank you, guests. Thank you, chief guest, for giving us your precious time. Thank you to our audience, members from the business community, members from the media. We have Harry Thompson, the first secretary from DFAT, who has been generously supporting our initiative for almost a year now. And we also have members from the development partners, other development partners. It's wonderful to have all of you. The purpose of the monthly macro update is to keep a tab on what's happening, right? And as Dr. Sadiq kind of rightly pointed out, that Bangladesh is not a boring country. Lot of things happen, both on the external front and on the internal front, and we are always back to the drawing board, thinking how to navigate this terrain. I mean, if you think about it, since 2020, we had 4 external shocks, if you say. We had the COVID-19, we had the Ukraine war, we had the Trump tariff saga that's still going on, and now on top of that, we had the Iran war. We are having the Iran war. 4 external shocks in last 6 years. And we had 3 governments in last 2 years and 2 political transition. So if you put those 4 external shocks with the political transition and the associated political uncertainty and the policy volatility, you can see that it's not an easy place to do business. It's not an easy place for anyone to operate, especially the business community who are trying to compete at the global level. These shocks, both internally and locally, creates headwind for the economy, creates strong headwind for, as Dr. Sadiq said, for the external sector. It creates headwinds for growth. It creates headwinds for the even inflation management, things like energy shocks, right? So in terms of growth, the growth outlook, Bangladesh has been navigating what can be said a low momentum growth outlook for last 2 years. Growth in fiscal year 25 was as bad as COVID year. It was 3.6, and it was not surprising. We have been doing this exercise for 12 months now, more than 12 months. We saw strong fall in import of capital machinery, almost a 16 to 20% fall, which reflects, the kind of investment appetite within the economy. But, and we had serious issues in our banking sector and in the fiscal sector, which limits public investment. So for the longest time, if you go back a while, we had this standard when we were doing the 6 plan and the 7 plan exercise. We had a standard narrative that Bangladesh's growth improved 1% each decade. And that has been the story till 2020. But since 2020, I think we have seen that the governance problems and the external shocks are finally having its bite on our growth potential. The PMI, which is produced by Policy Exchange, and we have Policy Exchange chair with us, shows some expansion over the last few months, but nothing to get too amazed about. And given that, one of the issues that we are now talking, especially by the newly elected government, is deregulation. And I feel that given our supply side problems, given the problem that we have limited fiscal strength and limited strength in our monetary capacity, supply side reforms, especially deregulation, or some may say smart regulation, can be an important stimuli for productivity and the economy. And we have pointed out that, if you compare Bangladesh across the Doing Business Index and other economic freedom index, Bangladesh does not perform very well compared to Vietnam, compared to India, compared to Sri Lanka. And this is an area where I feel when we have such problems on our fiscal avenue and monetary sector, deregulation or smart regulation, investment in energy can be a way for us to stimulate growth. These supply side reforms can play its part. I'm not going to touch the external sector. Dr. Sattar is going to touch the external sector, and it was partially touched. But if I go straight to the monetary sector, we have seen our strong fight against inflation. We have seen inflation to be a stubborn beast in Bangladesh. If you see India, Pakistan, other countries, inflation responded quite strongly to monetary tightening. In Pakistan, the policy rate was increased to 20%. In Sri Lanka, the policy rate was increased to even higher. And inflation fell very strongly, sharply, and then subsequently the policy rates were brought down. In Bangladesh, due to the political climate, we did tighten our monetary sector, but our thrust on our policy rate was not very high in comparative sense. And it creates a lot of debate on both sides. How high is really high? So I'm not going to touch that, but inflation did fell to a tightened monetary climate. If you see the moving average for inflation over the last 12 months, you can see that green line coming down quite steadily. And which is why I think many people feel that the cautionary monetary stance must continue. If you see the policy rate and the inflation wedge, you can see that the real policy rate, which is policy rate minus inflation, Bangladesh has the lowest real policy rate in the subcontinent. If you look at India, if you look at Pakistan, you look at Vietnam, Sri Lanka, they all have much higher real policy rate, if you look at the difference. So in terms of the bite of the policy rate on inflation, which comes from the real policy rate, not the nominal policy rate, we actually have a very low policy rate. And given now that we have the external sector turbulence with oil price shock, I was reading the literature of Volcker in the 1970s, that how inflation management happens during oil price shocks. And one of the key findings that came from 1970s is that oil price shocks have minimum effects on inflation in a tight monetary environment in comparison to a loose monetary environment. So the tight monetary environment makes it a sharp spike, but it falls down quickly. But in a loose monetary environment, the oil price shock pushes it higher and drags it long. So it has a long tail. So that is a key lesson that comes from the Volcker era, something that we might consider thinking while we are understanding the Iran war. In terms of NPL, we know that Bangladesh's banking sector was plundered mercilessly by oligarchs, politically connected oligarchs. I like to call them East India Company because they have plundered wealth like East India Company. I have no pun for my British friends anywhere here, but that's the truth. And you can see the diagram there that a lot of this bad loans or stolen loans, let's call it stolen loans, were hidden. You can see in December 2024, the private sector commercial bank NPL figure is reported to be only 7%. By June 2025, it has increased to 31%. That means once the AQR was happening, all this was revealed. So a big jump in the NPL was a product of the AQR, which was revealed. But also, we know last 1 year has not been easy for businesses to do. So a part of that story is also the business downturn. And we have seen that the government in December and October and November did open a policy support for businesses to reschedule loans. And that had an impact on NPL going down by 5%. So from 35.5%, it went to around 30.6%. And that's largely because of those NPL. But this is a problem. You cannot support a growth strategy with 5 trillion taka NPL on your balance sheet. You cannot expect banks to reduce interest rate if this money stands in their balance sheet. So time and time again, we have talked about the need for an asset management company, the need for offloading some of this NPL loan to an asset management company, the need for actually closing down some banks. There is no rationale for some banks to exist. And if I may say, right, there are questions about should government bail out banks like Padda Bank, right? Does it really need to stay? There are many banks which has lost the economic logic to stay with 98% NPL and 97% NPL. And even then, the fact that the governance reform has been taking place, we actually can see that, our deposit growth in our banking sector fell to 7% a year ago. It fell to 7%. Now, the confidence in the banking sector was emerging. And that is reflected by almost an 11% growth in deposits. In terms of private sector credit growth, the story is different. You know it better than me that almost everyone was waiting for an elected government to come so that they were holding on the investments. And therefore, the private sector credit growth has been very low, which is reflected in other numbers too. But bottom line from the financial sector analysis is that these reforms have now become necessary condition for a sustainable growth strategy. We cannot see financial sector governance reforms as an optional choice anymore. We must understand that these reforms is not only needed for an efficient financial sector, but now they have serious growth implication, especially for investment decisions of the private sector. In terms of fiscal, I remember the story is equally bad. Let me just put it in very simple way that our fiscal capacity is, I call this the pyramid of shame, one of the lowest tax to GDP in the world. And we have huge aspirations from the elected government. But how to finance those aspirations, right? With this kind of tax base, the aspirations must be grounded in reality. Without solving the fiscal problem, there is almost no financing of whatever development plan we have. So, and we respect every elected government has legitimate aspirations to create more jobs, to mitigate poverty, to create development. These are respectable, honorable aspirations. They are committed to their constituency. But given the fiscal space, we have to ask our question, where the financing will come from. And Dr. Sattar was leading the commission, the task force, task force on the tax GDP of increasing it to at least 15%, if I'm not wrong, to 2035. And a lot of suggestions have emerged. We have seen a modest improvement in revenue growth to 13%, sir. But let's put it in with caveat, our inflation is 8.5%. If you add 4% growth rate, then that's 12-13%. So in terms of real improvement in tax rate to GDP, nothing is going to happen this year with a 13% tax to GDP ratio. And this, you can see, is increasing our interest burden. Now, almost 35% of tax revenue is used to service interest rate. So 1/3 of every 30 cents from each of our paid taxes, dollar, is paid for interest payments. So that is the kind of fiscal architecture this country has, which is not sustainable for good growth strategy. And these, let me come back, and there's again what Dr. Sadiq pointed out, that our external debt is also increasing, which means now the debt repayments, the debt servicing divided by the exports and remittance are around 8 to 9%. It's still manageable. The thresholds are 14%. Some say it's 15, some say it's a bit higher, but it's still manageable. But it is a problem we have to keep notice. We have to keep track of. Of course, the fiscal constraint means that our public investment has become one of the lowest, which means that our ADP implementation rate is 16 years low in fiscal year 2026. And which is why, so at one end, you can see stagnation in private investment for all the global turbulences and local turbulences. On the other hand, you can see our ADP, our public investment, facing stagnation because of fiscal problem. And of course, now, generally, with the problem in the banking sector, the expectation generally is, after 2008, that the fiscal arm helps the monetary arm. The Treasury bails out the bank, the Treasury buys through bonds and many other mechanisms. But now that your fiscal arm is also weak, your monetary arm is also weak, we don't know how to navigate this without caution. So, bottom line from my presentation is there are headwinds, serious headwinds for our economy. The headwinds are driven by factors that are taking shape outside Bangladesh, and they're taking shape within Bangladesh. And the only way to navigate these headwinds is solid political commitment to economic reforms that will strengthen our financial sector, that will strengthen our fiscal sector. We cannot keep reform as a secondary option within the policy plate. Reform, 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 that should be the mantra within the first cycle, early cycle of political life, because if we miss this window, then the political dynamics will change and the appetite for reform will fall, and so will be the prospects for our growth potential. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Hatem. As usual, very substantive presentation. This entire presentation has a lot of policy issues that have been highlighted. What I would do is basically supplement
external sector.
Supplement the presentation by Dr. Hatem by giving some ideas on what is happening on the external sector, whatever is development. First of all, I've got to say that this, the theme of today's presentation is about global turbulence and how it affects our external sector vulnerabilities. So global development is very critical, and in my view, and perhaps it's going to become an idea pretty soon around the world. But this is what has just happened in the last week or so could lead us to a third world war. Pretty much it has all the ingredients for developing into a third world war situation. So we have to watch that. So this is a major shock to the economy, not just the global economy, which means to say that this the deferral request that Bangladesh has made to the United Nations is now looking stronger. It doesn't make sense for the UN system to tell Bangladesh that this is you've just passed all the criteria and therefore you graduate. So I think the deferment request has a lot of validation right now, and we hope that this deferment will take place, whether it's for 1 year, 2 years, or whatever. Since COVID, the history of deferment, we have seen that COVID led to the deferment of LDC graduation by 2 years on a general level. The same might happen this one. So this is first thing that I'd like to say. Bangladesh is also dealing with 3 trade agreements right now, which affects Bangladesh's current economic standing. First is the US Bangladesh trade deal. It's a trade deal that still needs to be ratified, but that is an understanding that some commitments have been given by the Bangladesh government. And after the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that these reciprocal tariffs are off the table, there's some positive news for Bangladesh in the sense that the reciprocal tariffs were differentiated. So we had a situation of relative tariff advantage under the reciprocal tariff regime. But now there is no relative tariff advantage. What we have is relative cost competitive advantage, which is going back to the old situation, but with higher tariffs. So the 15% tariff that has been imposed is on the existing MFN tariffs, which existed in the past. So that is something a lot of people don't realize that the reciprocal tariffs were on top of existing MFN tariffs. So we are facing, even with a 15% tariff, the situation doesn't look very good. However, with our chief guest, Mr. Hatem, present here, who leads the Knitwear Exporters Association, the Buy American Cotton Act 2025 is a positive development. It means that if we import American cotton and use it for producing either knitwear or woven garments, they get zero tariff access. That could be a substantial boost to Bangladeshi garment exports to the United States. However, one can argue that it doesn't need an agreement. Even without an agreement, you could get the advantage of that. Now, since the agreement has been committed by the Bangladesh government, the interim government, and although everybody thinks that we could have waited a few more days, we will have to follow some geopolitical pressures will be there. And then there will be some geo-economic developments as well. So we have that in the deal. The other, I think, I look at it, but the other point that we have shown in our slide, can you please show that slide? The tariff, there is a very interesting development that we have committed to, which is the United States tells Bangladesh that your trade regime is just too restrictive. You've got a bunch of, para tariffs. These have to be excluded. So in the tariff reduction framework that is very, methodically provided, they have said the only thing that we recognize is the customs duty. This is exactly what the WTO also would like to tell us. So all these supplementary duties, regulatory duties, all these things have to be taken out. So the tariff reduction framework that has been given starts with a big chunk, almost 5,000 tariff lines out of our 7,500 tariff lines have to be subject to zero duty. So it's a big opening up commitment to the US imports. Their argument is we have a big trade deficit with Bangladesh not because we don't have exportable items, but because you have a tariff regime which is just too restrictive. So they have argued for, to start with, once the agreement becomes valid, that is after ratification. So that's something to be waited for. So roughly more than half of the products coming from America will have zero tariff. But in 10 years, there's a 5-year phase out, there's a 10-year phase out. In 10 years, by 2035, the expectation is that Bangladesh goes into no custom duty for all imports from the United States, with some very limited extent. So basically, what they are suggesting is for the US, if you want to trade with the United States, you have to reach a free trade situation by 2035. However, there is no commitment about the US reducing its currently 15% across the board tariff. But I suppose that can be worked out. That should be part of the subsequent negotiations, which have not ended. So that is the state with the US Bangladesh. The EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan, it's a very generous offer. I personally feel, I have not looked at the details now, but what is clear that Japan is offering a free trade, zero tariff situation for more than 90% of Bangladesh's exports, including ready-made garments. So that's a good point. But Bangladesh also has to open up more than 1,000 tariff lines for zero duty. But there are also agreements on services side, substantial opening up of the services sector. So that's, we need to look at it a bit more deeply. I think Japan has been a very good partner for Bangladesh, an economic partner, and there's a lot of goodwill with Japan. And I think we can take this forward to be nice and quickly a free trade agreement, but EPA that we have signed is close to a free trade agreement. Then comes the big shock, which is the EU-India FTA. That's a big shock. Bangladesh has nothing to do with it, but it affects Bangladesh substantially. Bangladesh's export of garments to the EU is now going to face tremendous challenge with Indian exports, and they have planned this FTA, which has been under negotiation for 30 years, suddenly came to a conclusion last month. So this affects Bangladesh has now moved forward. We mentioned in the last month's update that Bangladesh has no option but to go for an FTA with the European Union. And the initial steps have been taken, but it will take at least 5 years. And Bangladesh will have to do exactly what they have offered the United States in order to get the FTA anywhere. So this is a big challenge that Bangladesh domestic import substituting producers have got to come up with. And here is a political government which will face this challenge, and they have to do something about it. So, these are the external sector development that Bangladesh will have to face. As far as exports are concerned, Dr. Sadiq has already mentioned that we have in the 7 months for this fiscal year, exports are down, but it's been compensated by a significant expansion in remittances, which is grown more than 20%. At this at the close of this fiscal year, we might have something like $38+ billion of remittances. So remittance growth has made up for the loss in export earnings. However, we need to recognize these remittances as also export of factor services. This is one thing we are not be able to recognize, and I don't see this being discussed much. This is actually our labor, our low-cost labor is actually producing output in a different country, but they are transferring their income into Bangladesh, which becomes part of the national income. So instead of exporting goods, we are exporting factor. The labor is a primary factor of production. So that is how we need to recognize remittances. And once this war is over, I think there will be a huge reconstruction activity in the Middle East, and Bangladeshi workers will be in huge demand. That is my projection, depending on how the situation turns out. So with those words, I think that's our distinguished panelist. I pass it on to Dr.
Sattar. I think the one point which has not been touched is even within the 7 days or 8 days of war, look at what has happened to global prices of energy. The last number I looked was as of Friday, the Brent crude was selling at $92 as compared with $65 before on 27 February. So that's a 45% increase in 7 days. The LNG prices, spot prices have increased by 70% in Europe. And then the shipping costs, quite different. Plus the fact that we do not have arrangement with other than with I think Qatar. Qatar is only arrangement. Getting LNG from USA, or that is an option. It will take time and the cost will be high. So what the point is, immediately we'll see an effect on the balance of payment. Very immediately. Even if the war were to end in the next few days, there will be a huge shock on the cost of production side. And the energy sector, we are all aware, is in shambles. So the arrears of IPPs alone are $700 million. So that will have another effect on the balance of payment. I think the point I'm making is there's no room for complacency. We really have to buckle under, and there has to be an emergency kind of a cabinet committee that looks into the macroeconomy with all its dimensions. Given the dire fiscal situation, given the banking sector turmoil, given the external sector issues, and there's no room for complacency. I think that we really have to look at the short-term difficulties that are coming up in a real emergency basis. There's no room for that. Politics can happen. Long-term safety nets and all that is they're all good ideas. But the immediate priority for the government is to really pay attention to this crisis. Otherwise, I see a lot of difficulties. With that, I open up the. I'll have to invite my very dear friend Masroor. We have worked together very closely for a long number of years, and he's an excellent what I call it antenna for business, because he keeps in a much more closer contact with the real economy than many of us who are sitting. I sit in Washington, where others are here. So, Masroor, you from your pragmatic perspective, what's going on and what do you think should happen?
Thank you. Private sector.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, for a very warm introduction. It's always a privilege to come to TRI and engage in such great dialogue and discussions in the presence of august stakeholders. And I was at MMI maybe 1.5 months ago. But this one is extra special because Dr. Ahmed is here, as he said, he's like a big brother to me. I don't know how much he learns from me. I'm very humble, but I certainly learned a lot that I currently bank on with regard to my professional and analytical judgments and work from Dr. Ahmed. So I think this MMI comes right at the cusp of a very important moment. And I was talking to Dr. Sattar and Dr. Ahmed that this particular topic under MMI this month could not have been more relevant given what we are having around the world. That's a fast developing scenario in the Middle East, global developments and external sector vulnerabilities. Sadiq Bhai's point, we cannot be complacent, I like to take that as my segue to get to my 3 or 4 important points I wanted to highlight. Why we cannot be complacent, I think Sadiq bhai mentioned in his introductory remarks. Bangladesh, I think if I see in the last 4 years, we are probably in the third dynamic phase. First phase, mid-2022 until August, September 24, when we landed into the macro crisis. Balance of payment particularly, along with many of the structural weaknesses and inefficiencies that we accumulated over the decades prior to that year. The second phase, August, September 24 until perhaps early February, is a phase of early stabilization. I'd like to emphasize early stabilization. I think that's where the issue of complacency and not getting complacent comes very valid. I think we have avoided a crash for sure. If you look at the numbers or the macro indicators until August 24, many of them were on constant deterioration, whether it's the FX reserve, inflation, exchange rate stability, and all the pertinent numbers and indicators. We have stopped the continuous decline. Reserves built up to 29, perhaps $30 billion BPMs. Inflation from 13% on papers. I'd like to highlight on papers, and I'll explain later why I say so. It has come down to close to 9%. Exchange rate has been stable, but at the same time, what Dr. Ashikur Rahman mentioned in his excellent presentation, we have also been going through a low growth scenario. 3.69, Ashik, has now been revised down to 3.4 or 4.9.
3.5.
3.5. 0.49, 3.5%. So, yes, we have stopped the decline. Yes, we have made some progress in some of the macro foundations, such as the foreign reserves, the balance of payment, trade deficit, narrowing the trade deficit. However, it is far from a place where we can be complacent. It is far from a place where we can actually leverage these macro foundations for our growth aspirations. Now, with that, the third phase arrives. The third phase, as of February 12th, and I think March 1st. March 12th, we land back to democratic Bangladesh with the elected government with a big political mandate. So Bangladesh back in politics. Good politics, I would like to hope. Second, as of 1st March, the global scenario lands in what Dr. Sattar mentioned, which could, hope not, but which could lead to much broader global conflict, including closer to global wars and so on. Now, these two developments make this factor that we cannot be complacent, and we need to analyze our macro far more prudently and take policy decisions accordingly, a lot more important. Why do I say so? Couple of minutes on the political developments. With the political government back, I think a lot of the stagnations, Dr. Rahman mentioned, for instance, our ADP, annual development plan, and expenditures have been 16 years low in the first 7 months of current fiscal, but it was 20 years low in the last fiscal. And the public investment does have a role in fueling growth and employment, particularly at a time of depressed private sector activities, right? And then, of course, the country's productive capacity has not been in a good shape. The growth model we have followed in the last 10, 15 years was overly infrastructure oriented. As a result, the productive capacity oriented growth has also already been missing. So we need to bring that back. The political aspirations will have to drive public spending up, the annual development expenditures up. They have corresponding import elements. So they are all going to have pressure on both macro fiscal as well as on balance of payment. The macro financial, I'll come a little later. So that's political. But today's session, today's particular topic, the global developments and external vulnerabilities, I think it could not have been more sensitive, if not risky. as we approach the next months and year and perhaps the next 5 years. Let me start with the Iran war, the Middle East war. It has three very direct risks for Bangladesh's economy, starting with direct implications for macro, particularly balance of payment and foreign exchange scenario. The three risks that that emanates from this particular conflict: A, the availability and prices of energy. And as you know, energy has multifaceted transmission channel for the entire economy. Transport, production of power, agriculture inputs, whether it's fertilizer or irrigation, and global shipments, where exports remain a very important element for our macroeconomic stabilization and further strengthening the balance of payment and the foreign exchange scenario. The second is the export competitiveness, which has started taking a hit with regard to the shipping costs, the shipping arrangements availability, and in case of a protracted war, the potential impact in the European and North American markets and consumption, ultimately affecting our export demand. Third, remittances and overseas employment. As Dr. Sattar mentioned, and I think Sadiq, you also mentioned, remittances growth has been spectacular. And this stabilization or early stabilization we are experiencing since September 2024, it has been hugely benefited by this $30 billion landmark that we have achieved with regard to remittances. Perhaps I call 28% growth in the fiscal 24-25. Now, on the energy availability and prices, I mean, availability, Bangladesh procures about 6 million tons of LNG every year. About 4 million of that comes from Qatar. And if you add UAE and Oman, it's probably close to 5 million tons. So this is almost 70-80% of our LNGs coming from that conflict-affected area. With regard to crude oil and refined petroleum, straight 80% comes from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE. So all of these are now at stake. Hormuz is not operating. Just to give you one sense, with regard to the problem that we have already landed in 8 days of war, 2 ships are already affected with regard to LNGs. So they were supposed to arrive somewhere in the middle of March, between 2nd and 3rd week of March. They're not going to arrive on time. March, April, May, 3 months projection, 22 ships were expected to come with LNG to Bangladesh. 18 of them will have to pass through Hormuz. So if there is a protracted war, they're not coming. We can certainly source from alternatives, but it takes time. And the alternative they're getting busy as well, because it's not only Bangladesh, the entire world is now looking for alternatives. Second comes the price. So before the price, if there is supply disruption, we have problem with transportation of all our petroleum imports we bring in. 63% goes into transportation, 15% goes into agriculture, and this is primarily diesel. And diesel forms around 66-67% of our total petroleum import. So you have, with the transportation, you're going to have problems with moving freight, moving labor. Labor mobility is usually contingent on transport. You're going to have disruption with agri production, because particularly irrigation and fertilizer, and power production. There is a big number of Bangladeshi power plants which runs on fuel as well as on gas. But I'm coming to gas a little later. Second is the price. Sadiq mentioned the Brent prices are already about $90. The whole of the 2026 projection was supposed to be $60 max. So Bangladesh imported around $6 billion of petroleum last fiscal. So if the war goes on for about a month, the projection is that Brent will reach $150. So that is going to be almost double of what Bangladesh had projected for its import in petroleum. And for LNG, the prices, there is an Asia platform called JKM, Japan-Korea market, which is a reflection or reference point for LNG price in Asia. 63% rise within the last 1 week. Northwestern Europe, 57% rise. Now, Last year, Bangladesh imported $5 billion of LNG, $4.95 billion. It is now already $26, the spot prices. If the war goes on for another 2 weeks, it's going to exceed the Ukraine war rate, the $38. So we are looking at 3 to 4 times additional LNG bill to be footed. So where is this going to come from? So as Dr. Sadiq very rightly said, it comes to the macro, it comes to the balance of payment, it comes to the foreign exchange reserve, and the pressure it's going to create on exchange rate and so on. So we have to take it very carefully. The second is the export. Now, export, I want to not only focus on the Middle East war is bringing to us, but there are some issues that have been boiling over the last few years, and I want to touch upon that. But just on Middle East war, $900 million was our direct export to the Gulf countries last fiscal year. Not a lot, but when we are trying to increase by all means, even $1 billion, close to $1 billion will matter. Okay, I think the shipment are already increasing the shipment cost and time. Global shipping companies have started now avoiding Gulf of Aden and Suez Canal. So they're routing their ships via Cape of Good Hope. It's usually minimum 10 days additional time, around 30% extra cost. And when it comes to LNG and oil petroleum carriers, LNG carriers have gone up, their costs have gone up 650% from $41,000 a day, or by, I think, the full load, by certain day, or maybe by, I think it is day, not by the whole voyage. It is now about $300,000. On petroleum carriers, $20 a ton crude oil has now gone up to $100 a ton, shipping costs. Bangladesh was already suffering or at a disadvantage from a speed to market and logistics efficiency perspective compared to its structural competitors as well as aspirational competitors. Now, with this getting added, the export competitiveness is getting hit. And in the case of a protracted war, the European and the North American demand is going to fall. And that's where our export, which is already struggling for 7 months, we have a 7-month straight drop in export growth. 3% is the average last 8 months, negative growth. And this is just going to compound that problem. But this is not Middle East only, which is actually the headaches for our export diversification, sustaining exports and export competitivity. We had 3 global issues which were already creating a number of risks for us. Number one, what happens post NDC? Whenever it happens in 26 or 2099, if Bangladesh's application is approved, Bangladesh lands in a highly competitive international scenario. Are we ready for that? We are not. I think Dr. Sattar mentioned. I think the application for the extension has a lot of validity. Of course, there are other schools of thoughts as well who have some valid points too. But in my view, when we qualified first in 2020, final qualification in 2021, since then, until August 24, the then government were basically rejoicing, the celebratory mode. Reforms didn't happen, improvement plans didn't happen. Some committees came, and in Bangladesh government, anytime a committee is formed, it's the death of that issue. So that has happened. Last 18 months, unfortunately, under interim government, no improvement has happened either with regard to preparation for the post-LDC scenario. And I hope Hatem Bhai will elaborate on that, because he and I often talk on this one. So as a result, we are not prepared. We would love to graduate. We don't want to remain where we don't belong. However, are we prepared? And some analysts refer to Nepal, Laos, and Cambodia. They're not going for an deferral request, but their export dependence and vulnerability is not as high as Bangladesh's. I forgot who's got how much export, but 3 of them, their exports are $3 billion, $8 billion, and $15 billion, as opposed to ours last year total $50 billion plus. So any drop in that export, and at a time when we are trying to recover from macro, where balance of payment and foreign exchange is a big area to deal with, we cannot absorb any big shocks in our exports. So that's one external global vulnerability for long time. Second is what Ashik said, the trade protectionism manifested in its worst form through the reciprocal tariff. Okay, so we may have an agreement with the US. However, this is already having far-reaching implications. As Dr. Sattar said, Europeans have been closely following this, and I'm sure our friends from Australia, Japan, Canada might also be following this. If we, why we signed an agreement like this, why there are clauses, certain clauses that those are which are there, there can be a big debate, but we have signed it. We have said we agreed to this, and the others now have a right, other trading partners now have a right to come and talk to us and say, why won't we be treated in the same way? And that's what is going to come to haunt us when we talk about, with or without LDC, the post-GSP world, the labor issues and many other.
They have also signed up.
They have also signed up. Yes. So I think this already is also creating competitive pressure in markets beyond North America or United States. Just to give an example, the European Union, you've seen the drop in the last 7 months had largely been instigated by the sluggish performance of Bangladeshi exports in EU markets. EU is a market where China and India has been maneuvering very aggressively since April last year, since the Trump tariff came in, because they have higher tariffs imposed on them. India has signed something with 18%, but they still have 50% because the Russian oil-related penalty tariffs are still valid on India until a solution around this ART comes into play for India, because India has not signed it yet.
India has a framework agreement.
Framework agreement.
Yeah, but
the ART.
50% has been.
But
until this
18% of gas.
18% is
Reciprocal tariff is gone.
But they'll still have the Russian oil-related 25% penalty. Still valid, So India and China has been aggressively marketing in the European Union, offering up to 5 to 6% concession, which is a big concession in export market. Ahmed, I will tell you, and Bangladesh, because it is not as strong on its value addition, on its export efficiency, trade costs are higher, production and business costs are higher. Bangladesh is not able to match the concessions that the Chinese and the Indians are offering in the European market. So it's already causing us problem. And third, the global regulatory framework, particularly from a standards perspective, they are fast changing. European Union is bringing in CBAM, the carbon border adjustment measures, where you don't have the certain level of carbon efficiency, you pay a higher tax. Circular economy, EU circular economy strategy, the EU Green Deal, the H&M, Germany's farm and country-specific regulatory standards. Bangladesh at the moment is not very advanced with regard to meeting those standards. So unless we can actually strengthen our ability to comply with the standards, in 3 years' time, we are going to face another big trouble. So all of this percolate down to meeting our macro. So why it's so relevant, these external vulnerabilities and the monthly macro insight, I think it needs no further introduction, but Bangladesh hopefully will put together a plan. I think we've heard government, both from the central bank and the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, talking about contingency measures, talking about alternative sourcing. But Bangladesh Bank, at least I think since yesterday, has also been putting their thoughts together with regard to hit on the foreign exchange and how they absorb any sudden shock in the energy prices, which has already started coming into play as of last 3 or 4 days. So, but some of the preparations are long-term and structural. So they will require the reforms that Ashikur, Sadiq and Zaidi mentioned. Our anti-export bias needs a huge deal of policy reorientation, particularly with regard to our highly protective tariff regime. Dr. Sattar mentioned that. Our diversification has all been a talk, has less been walking the talk. We don't see sectoral privatization. We don't see an integrated export competitiveness improvement measures. We also do not see the necessary investment climate, which will bring in particularly the FDI that is going to be critical for diversification of exports and also to encourage local investments in new productive sectors or globally tradable sectors. So we have a long way to go. There are sudden or the imminent risks which have emanated suddenly from the Middle Eastern scenario. This is a real shock, and this can take our macro back to where we were back in 2022, 2023. We also have political developments, which in a positive way is going to raise the demand for investments, for economic activities. And if we want to take our growth back to 4.5 to 5.5, as Sadiq wrote in today's TBS, our FX level is not at all sufficient to support that growth level. And thirdly, our long-standing structural weaknesses, they require significant time-bound integrated reform programs, without which these global vulnerabilities and external factors will continue to haunt us in our export competitiveness, export diversification, balance of payment, and the macro. Thank you very much for giving me the chance.
Thank you, Masroor, for your excellent presentation. I really think you brought a lot of substance and value added to the discussion, food for thought. Downside risks are real, and I think the question is how quickly and how well prepared are we to respond to the risks. So hope that this discussion will have some impact in terms of alerting the government. I'm sure they're also thinking very significantly in the subject. With this, I will now open the floor for questions, comments, thoughts. Would you please mind introducing yourself and then make your point?
My name is Kamal Hassan. I work for
Mike Tadil.
My name is Kamal Hassan.
I sound like finished? Hello. বলতে পারবেন?
My name is Kamal Hassan. I work for Bollywood program. It's an organization. Thank you for all the comments based on the presentation, but I'm not totally agree with what the last speaker was saying about the country and how it's been shaped last 2 years. I think it's been in good hand last 2 years. But we are talking comfortably today because what work has been done last 2 years. And you should appreciate it, all the reforms they have taken, despite all the non-cooperation they're getting from all the corners. So we should give credit where it is due, and you should always be hopeful for the future. My question is, we talk about GDP. Every time you talked about any numbers, like tax to GDP ratio, the investment ratio. But we know GDP how overstated in our country the last 10 years. Should we take into account when you refer those numbers, the percent is low GDP? One estimate said our GDP is 150 billion less what is stated now. There's one study says. I just don't want to talk about how the GDP is inflated last 10 years. And we refer all the numbers, how credible that will be. Whether that will be any study to find the real GDP actually. That's my concern.
Don't quote those $150 billion less. They are not credible at all.
Let it have it say.
It's important to
let us not.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that our GDP is correct because all the things you talked about.
Who are you asking to make sure? It is the government who is.
I'm just expressing my opinion. Whoever in the position to do it.
Because
our prediction.
Just a clarification. When this point was made, the report was given to the government was responsible. They rejected it, and they are using the same GDP as before.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, I don't think we should really use that as a basis.
Okay, we don't use it, but other things that what Dr. Ashikur has said are lowest tax GDP ratio, right? If GDP is so high, if we are doing so good, that issue should improve, right? We have the lowest GDP tax liquidation in the world. It's not a matter of joke. So we need to look into the GDP first, because when you put anything, any projection for the future, any plan for the future, or anything about the past, the GDP is
Different debate.
Sorry. Stay on the subject. We are really moving away from this. This is not a GDP discussion. GDP figure is discussion. Point is, you see the external vulnerabilities that are here is real. Do you think that we are ready to face it? Do you think that there's a need for policy discussion and debate? Let us stay on that.
Yeah,
we have a separate discussion on GDP at a later time.
But I have a valid point or not, I just want to make sure. Is it something to have to know?
I'm sorry, because if the government does not accept those figures, who are we? We don't have any basis for talking about GDP because the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics has the authority, the staffing, the responsibility. If the government accepts it, my perception, your perception is zero value.
I think we are talking from independent institute, right? We're not government. We're gonna bring out the facts.
I think
what's happening in the country.
Sorry, we are wasting our time. Let us.
I don't think we're wasting our time. I think I raised
we can talk about it. I'm not talking about you. Let us stay on the topic. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you.
Well, sir, may I talk, sir? Thank you, sir. This is Mohammad, sir, economic journalist. The presentation and the discussion of you people sitting here, that points are emanating, basically, you hammered, in my assessment, hammered on the banking sector reform. However, vested groups and circles are everywhere. We cannot deny it. Fact is this, the previous governor of the previous government, did some work to bring in reforms, especially with regard to the banking affairs, banking reforms, and most of them have been left unaccomplished. But they did, and on some issues, they edged near the final point, but they could not sign. So far, my information is concerned. So my point is this: you see, there is always a conflict between a political government and a non-political government. Always, political governments generally have many commitments, many things to do. In the past, we have seen that. So do you think that the same thing would occur here? Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Uwais Fareh. I'm the senior economic advisor in UNDP. I have just one point to make. An excellent presentations. I don't have anything to add, and the way you described the transmission channels, it was quite insightful. There's never a good time for a crisis. This is probably even worse to have yet another crisis, and how it will affect Bangladesh and many other countries. There's a lot of anxiety. I'm worried in particular because I was looking forward to structural reforms. A lot of work has been done in the last year or so to bring macroeconomic stability. That work, of course, needs to continue. Now we have an external shock, but also structural transformation, because some studies have already shown that the growth has run out of steam, and there is this weakening of this relationship between GDP and jobs, for example. So where do we find new sources of growth? Of course, that requires structural transformation. And there are going to be some reforms. Obviously, those are going to be contentious, controversial as well, which also means deregulation. There are different views people have. And I'm wondering how that can be communicated, not only among experts sitting, what are some of the benefits and downsides of those reforms in the long term. Because in the current environment, with deglobalization and inward-looking that we have seen that stance, there may not be that much appetite for deregulation, particularly areas related to high tariffs and so forth. But I think we need to get the messaging right as experts And the good thing that I see is that we're living in a region which is already contributing 60% of the GDP growth to the world. So it accounts for 30% of the GDP. And it's lively, and we are living in a Asian century. I think Asia is going to be the driver of growth in the future. And there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from East Asia, Southeast Asia.
Can you expand on the point why you think there won't be any appetite for deregulation?
Because of people are looking more inward. There is more protection. And there might be an instinct. We're not seeing that in Asia yet, but to reciprocate that, because it's almost like it's a kind of a game theory. If you're seeing what other countries are doing, they're protecting their markets. We are looking at that. Tariffs have been raised.
Deregulation.
So there might be, but this is not the right time for a country like Bangladesh.
Good point.
Yeah. So how do we do that? It's not easy, and there are always going to be, those who benefit and losers as well. And there is also a lot of lessons to be learned how people who may end up losing out of this deregulation, how they can be compensated. New measures can be help them. And I think it relates to export competitiveness, job creation. If you're opening up, there will obviously going to be some implication. What can government do in order to ensure that it doesn't happen, that disruption is minimized? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We have other.
Common achievement.
Thank you. এখান থেকে কেউ বলবেন না? Let's invite our guest from the
Harry?
Australian High Commission.
Please.
Thank you very much, professors and esteemed guests for having me here today. My name is Harry from the Australian High Commission. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And thank you for the very insightful discussion. I think there's so many key themes, and I think the bigger picture issues are these external shocks, and combined with sort of a period of new opportunity for Bangladesh. It's just an unprecedented time. And I don't use those words lightly. Something I wanted to talk about was, I guess, there's a common theme in the sense that some of the data in this presentation, kind of particularly on that deposit growth item, shows how there is an element of increased consumer confidence. And what I'm interested in is, the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. If these external events are going to happen, and as Australia, as a regional economy, and Bangladesh as a regional economy as well, there's not too much we can really do about those external events. So the question is, how do we adapt? And when we have this unique time where there is this increased confidence, I'd love to hear from all the professionals here on what are the sort of the three actions we can do to capitalize on, like what needs to happen now, because I think it's just such an unprecedented time, but also an opportunity. I think, just to touch on a few other points, I think, Australia as an island country as well, for us, shipping is a very significant source of our imports and exports. And so these increased costs that are being passed on is something we're acutely aware of as well, and the impacts it can have on sort of trade-dependent economies. But it's also a point that the Australian government has been making in the past sort of few years, has been on diversification in a trade sense of exports and imports. So for us, LNG is obviously a big export market, and it struck me how there was a lot of conversation around that uncertainty around, securing LNG imports and what that means for Bangladesh. So there are some complementarities there, which just really stood out to me. And the last point I just wanted to make was, thank you to everyone for coming in, having this resource here, this set of common facts, which we can all read, and though we may disagree on some points, we're speaking the same language. And I think that is really important, and just having a common set of facts that we are discussing. So thank you very much for your work in preparing this and for the insightful discussion.
Just one comment.
Interesting times has been reflected. I have a little issue here. And in this sort of situation, we see globally, domestically, there are big challenges. Is growth the prime driver, or should we come to a point that we have growth at a level which we are able to go through in the next few years, because we don't want to get into some sort of a boom and a bust type of cycle. And when external finance gets into trouble, domestic finance gets into trouble. So I want to, this is Sadiq bhai, because should we be overemphasizing the need for growth? One. Number two, in this sort of situation, the global turmoil is there. And even if the war stops, I don't think the shock waves will go away. An important thing is that should we look inside, especially we must ensure our food security, absolutely, first and foremost. And then should there be efforts so that people at a lower equilibrium can keep continuing to be involved. And here deregulation comes in, because it's not just the tariff type of deregulation. How does a small business really operate? And because is it have the same ability to operate? There are serious challenges over there. How do jobs get created? How do you create new entrepreneurs at a local level, a small level? So policies and other things, while we try to take care of the macro, there's effort, I think, needs to be focused on. Because what is happening is all beyond control. Oil prices go up. What do? We have to reduce the consumption of oil, as simple as that. Can we finance the power generation at this point of time? Maybe not. What do? So there has to be, because I think the world is now going through a serious, and we need to look into it.
Just one comment before Chief Guest. On your question of GDP growth and all that stuff, I think you have to answer that by looking at the political economy and the environment under which we find ourselves. I think the unrest of the 2024, the elections, promises, etc. If you look at it, we are in a very precarious situation as far as the economy is concerned. With a 3.5% GDP growth rate, basically what we see in the social area, rising open unemployment in the educated youth, severe underemployment of most people, falling real wages, rising poverty, rising income inequality, and in that environment, I do not think any political government can afford to say, okay, for the bad time. The question is, there has to be at least two core elements of the political economic question that you answer. One is, I need to have a growth, but that growth must be not the type of growth we had before, where the point you're making, small and medium enterprises, rural enterprises, all that stuff. So I think 100% right. That's the only way that we can reduce poverty. And inequality is the same thing, but for that you need some system. A new government initiative about the farmer's card and the family card, what is that? It's really trying to say that these people have been bypassed by development in a way. The only way you reach them is either through job creation and giving them better health education, and through safety net programs forward. And that requires fiscal space. So you cannot not have fiscal space, number one. Irrespective of how you measure GDP, forget about tax to GDP ratio. Talk about the real amount of money that is available. We know that we do not have enough money to fund these programs. The government today is borrowing to meet their current expenditure. They're selling treasury bill, pay interest costs, pay the salaries of the civil servants, and to pay for the subsidies. Forget about everything else. Now, where are you going to fund all these programs that we are talking about? Additional programs, they're essential. I don't think you can afford it. We have to also recover the growth. An economy which spends so little on health, and the health expenditure has crashed, literally. You have to have fiscal space. So whether we like it or not, macro will be there. Whether we like it or not. You cannot go and ask for belt tightening across. Maybe what you should do is go to the rich people who have really not paid their due in terms of taxes, in terms of everything else, and ask for a social contract by which you extract, tell the parliamentarians, they're all millennials or millennials, well, I'm told 80% of the parliament are millennials. You could tell them, can you all now change the social contract? We are having belt tightening. The prices have gone up, it's not in my control. But now you guys who have not paid your due share, pay the share, and let them redistribution. That's what I would talk about, the real political picture. Not,
Sorry, but even I think Khushid Bhai also had a point whether we should focus more for the time being on domestic. I don't think we can afford to, because we being a net import dependent country, for the running the domestic economy.
No, I didn't say it. I don't know.
Achha, sorry.
the point is
The question of
you
you can see the whole presentation, everything. It looks like it is only that external thing. Is what I think that's a wrong way of looking at it, because we are overemphasizing something. Of course, you need your exports. Of course, you have to be able to buy. It's a question of you are talking of things where there is already an uncertainty is building. Don't forget this part, because at the end of it is people. That means there has to be a healthy balance. Of course, fiscal space has to be brought in. Of course, fiscal space has to be brought in. No doubt about that.
Let me use the chairman's prerogative to bring a closure to this. I think this is a growth versus distribution issue that is long past. I think we've settled. We have to have growth in order to have poverty reduction. And what Dr. Sadiq said very clearly, yes, we need to have inclusive growth. That is how we describe. So growth, we have to work on resuscitating our growth rate. And the 3.5% growth is not Bangladesh's potential growth rate. So we have to get back to our usual normal standard trajectory of growth. So, but we also agree we need to look at the distribution, the poverty reduction part, and you cannot have poverty reduction with slow growth or no growth at all. So let's accept that. The final. Thank you. Now, Chief Guest get to it.
Yeah, please. We invite the Mohammad Hatem to make his interventions.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable guest present here today, and PRI Chairman Mr. Zaidi, Sattar, Moderator, and others speakers. Assalamu alaikum. প্রথমে আমি মিস্টার আশিক এবং দুজনকে ধন্যবাদ দিলাম। টু দ্য পয়েন্টে বেশ কিছু বিষয় তুলে এনেছেন। আমি মিস্টার আশিকের ওই চারটা যে ভার্নাবিলিটি যে গ্লোবাল টার্বুলেন্স ওই জায়গা থেকে আমি একটু যেতে চাই এবং পারফেক্টলি এই জায়গাটাকে মেনশন করা হয়েছে যে আমরা এই টার্বুলেন্সের কারণে গ্লোবাল টার্বুলেন্সের কারণে টোটাল ওয়ার্ল্ডের ইকোনমি যেমন একটা ম্যাসাকার হয়ে গেছে, আবার এট দ্য সেম টাইম বাংলাদেশও কিন্তু এটার মানে এই ধাক্কায় মানে পর্যদস্ত হয়ে গেছে। এবং বিশেষ করে আমরা এই কোভিড এর পরে যেটা গেল রাশিয়া ইউক্রেন যুদ্ধের ধকল কিন্তু আমরা এখনো কাটিয়ে উঠতে পারি। তারপরে ট্রাম্পের যে ট্রেডিং, একটা আনপ্রেডিক্টেবল একটা ট্রাম্পের সিচুয়েশন। ইভেন আমি আজকে ওইখানে ওনার সাথে বসে শুরুতে কথা বলছিলাম যে আমাদের যে চুক্তিটা সই হয়েছে মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের সাথে, এই চুক্তিটা একটা অবশ্যই আমি বলবো যে এটা একটা অসম চুক্তি এবং সাথে অনৈতিক চুক্তি। সাথে বেশ কিছু জায়গায় অনৈতিক কিছু পয়েন্ট আছে যেটা আমাদেরকে বাধ্য করা হচ্ছে। যেমন ধরেন যে আমেরিকা ইসরায়েলের উপর ইসরায়েল আমেরিকা ওখানে যে অত্যাচারটা হচ্ছে সেটাকে মানে তারা যদি কোনো পয়েন্ট ওখানে এরকম আছে যে তারা যদি কোথাও কারো স্যাংশন দেয় তাদের বিরুদ্ধে কারো কোনো দেশের বিরুদ্ধে ব্যবস্থা নেয় সেটাকে আমাদের সমর্থন করতে হবে। তো অন্যভাবে তুমি এক জায়গায় ওই ভেনেজুয়েলা থেকে প্রেসিডেন্ট উঠে নিয়ে গেছো, এই ধরনের জিনিস আমাদেরকে সাপোর্ট করতে হবে, এইটার কম যাবে। তো সুতরাং এই চুক্তি আমরা বলেছি যে এই চুক্তিটা রিভিজিট করা হোক প্রয়োজনে। এখন যেহেতু মানে 15% তো ফলো সবার জন্য সমান, তাহলে আমার কি বেনিফিট? শুধু বেনিফিটের জায়গায় একটাই আমাদের চুক্তির মধ্যে আছে, সেটা হলো যে তাদের র মেটেরিয়ালস দ্বারা তৈরি পণ্য রপ্তানির ক্ষেত্রে আমরা ডিউটি ফ্রি অ্যাক্সেস পাবো। তাও সেখানে আমার কিন্তু কন্ডিশন আছে, ঠিক আছে। বাট ওই এতটুকু মানে সুবিধার জন্য আমরা রাষ্ট্রের আরো বড় বড় অসুবিধা ফেলবো, এটা আমরা মনে করি। এখানে আমি এই ইয়ের সাথে যে এইটা একটা মানে টার্বুলেন্সের সাথে আরেকটা যেটা মেইন পয়েন্ট আমি রেজ করতে চাই, লোকালি একটা টার্বুলেন্স যেটা আমি প্রতিবন্ধকতা বা বাধা, সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমাদের যে টাকা, এই টাকা ওভার ভ্যালুড হয়ে আছে 34%। এটা একটা ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ইয়েতে আমি দেখলাম যে তারা এটা যাচাই বাছাই করে রিপোর্ট করেছে যে 34% ওভার ভ্যালু। ফলে কি দাঁড়াচ্ছে, আমি এর মধ্যে 2-3টা ফ্যাক্টরির সাথে কথা বলে দেখলাম যে তারা যে $5 লাখ, সবচেয়ে ছোট ফ্যাক্টরি সাইজের $5 লাখ যে মাসে এক্সপোর্ট করে, যদি 20% করে সে ইয়েটা নেয় বা টাকাটা ক্যাশ করে, তাহলে তার $1,25,000 কমপক্ষে সে 51 লক্ষ টাকা প্রতি মাসে সে লস করছে। এবং সেখানে তার শ্রমিকের বেতন, ওই ফ্যাক্টরির শ্রমিকের বেতন এরকম ওই 40 থেকে 50 লাখ টাকার মধ্যে শ্রমিকের বেতন। তার মানে সে 50 লাখ টাকা 40-50 লাখ শ্রমিকের বেতন দেওয়ার পরে এরপরে যেটা লস করতেছে, তার কিন্তু আলটিমেটলি আদার এক্সপেন্ডিচারে গিয়ে সেই জায়গাটা কন্টিনিউয়াস লস করতেছে। এবং আমি বেশ কিছুদিন যাবত আপনাদের এখানে মিডিয়ার আমার বন্ধুরা আছেন, আমি কিন্তু কন্টিনিউয়াস বলে যাচ্ছি যে অন্তত মিনিমাম 80% গার্মেন্টস ফ্যাক্টরি গত কয়েক বছর যাবত লসে রান। এবং আমরা বেশ কিছুদিন যাবত আমাদের ইন্ডাস্ট্রি আমাদের লেস ক্যাপাসিটিতে অ্যাটলিস্ট 50-60% ক্যাপাসিটিতে আমরা রান করতেছি। তো ফলে প্রতি মাসে কিন্তু আমরা বিশাল পরিমাণে একটা লস আমাদের গুনতে হচ্ছে। তো আলটিমেটলি আমি রফতার সাহেব যখন গভর্নর ছিলেন, তখন আমি ওনাদেরকে বলেছিলাম যে আপনারা যে ডলারের রেট 2টা করে রেখেছেন, নিশ্চয়ই আপনাদের মনে আছে, 195 টাকা আর 160 টাকা, 8 টাকা, 9 টাকা এরকম ছিল। তাহলে এই যে 13, 14, 15 টাকার যে ডিফারেন্স, আমি কন্টিনিউয়াস ওনাকে আমি বলেছি যে আমার প্রতি মাসে আমার নিজের মানে এরকম কয়েক কোটি টাকা লস হইতেছিল ওই কারণে, শুধু ওই কারণে। কারণ আমার এক্সপোর্ট ডকুমেন্টসটা তারা কিনছে 95 টাকা করে, আবার আমার পেমেন্ট দিকে তারা আবার ওই টাকা দিয়ে আবার আমার ডলার কি কিনতেছে 108 টাকা, 9 টাকা দিয়ে। ফলে এই যে ডিফারেন্স, এই ডিফারেন্স কিন্তু আমরা এই গত কয়েক বছরে হিউজ পরিমাণে একটা লস করেছি। তো এখনো যে টাকাকে ওভার ভ্যালুড করে রাখা হয়েছে, তাতে কিন্তু কন্টিনিউয়াসলি আমরা কিন্তু লস করে যাচ্ছি। আলটিমেটলি এই দায়টা কে নিবে? তো এই জায়গাগুলো আমার মনে হয় আপনাদের একটু কথা বলা দরকার।
আপনি বলছেন আর ডেপ্রিসিয়েশন করতে,
অফকোর্স আপনি ইনফ্লেশনটাকে তো আমরা অ্যাডজাস্ট করতে হবে প্রতি বছর। আপনি তো ইনফ্লেশন অ্যাডজাস্ট করেন। ওনারা বাংলাদেশ এখন কি করছে, বিওবি পদ্ধতিতে তারা ডলারের রেট ব্যালেন্স অফ পেমেন্ট, কিন্তু হওয়া উচিত এটা পিপিপি, পাওয়ার পারচেজিং পেরিটি, কিন্তু এটা ওনারা করছেন না, যার কারণে আমরা এই লসটা আমরা করতেছি। তো এই জায়গাটা আমার মনে হয় ঠিক করা দরকার। আপনি দেখেন নিটওয়ারে যেটা আমরা বলছিলাম যে নিটওয়ারে কিন্তু আমাদের ভ্যালুয়েশন সবচেয়ে বেশি। বাংলাদেশের এক্সপোর্টের মধ্যে আমাদের বইয়ের মধ্যে নিটওয়ারের ভ্যালুয়েশন বেশি। এবং ইভেন আমার বিকেএমএর অন্তত 50% মানে ফ্যাক্টরি মানে যারা আমার মেম্বার, তাদের বন্ড লাইসেন্স নাই, অর্থাৎ তারা বিদেশ থেকে কোনো কিছু আমদানি করে না, 100% লোকাল ম্যাটেরিয়াল দ্বারা তৈরি পণ্য রপ্তানি। বাট একটা আশ্চর্য জিনিস দেখি, তাদেরকে নানাভাবে এই কার্যক্রমে প্রতিবন্ধকতা তৈরি করা হয় যে তাকে বন্ড লাইসেন্স করতে বাধ্য করা হয়। একদিকে সরকার বলছে যে বন্ডের অপব্যবহার হচ্ছে, আবার আবার ইন্ডাস্ট্রিকে বন্ড লাইসেন্স করার জন্য বাধ্য করা হচ্ছে। বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকের ফরেন এক্সচেঞ্জ পলিসি ম্যানুয়ালের 38, 39, 40 এবং 41 তিনটা ক্লজের মধ্যে ওখানে বলে দেওয়া আছে আমাকে যে ব্যাক টু ভ্যাকেন্সি দিচ্ছে ব্যাংক, এটা করতে হবে আন্ডার বন্ডেড ওয়্যারহাউস লাইসেন্স। বাট এটা ওরা মানছে না, অনেক মানে সব ব্যাংকে শুরু থেকে মানছে না, কারণ আমাদের যারা ইয়েতে পারে বন্ড লাইসেন্স নাই, তাদের তো ব্যাক টু ভ্যাক হচ্ছে, শুরু থেকে হচ্ছে। মাঝে মাঝে সেখানে কোনো ব্যাংক এটাকে আটকে দিচ্ছে, প্রতিবন্ধকতা তৈরি করছে। তো আমরা যখন আবার ফোন করি, কথা বলি, তখন আবার এটাকে ছেড়ে দিচ্ছি। তাহলে এই একটা আইন ওখানে থাকবে কেন? এটা নিয়ে বহুবার আমি কথা বলেছি। 2014 সালে একবার আমি বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংককে চিঠি দিয়ে বলেছি যে আপনাদের এই ফরেন এক্সচেঞ্জ পলিসি গাইডলাইন থেকে এটাকে সরান, এটাকে রেক্টিফাই করে। কারণ যে সময় ফরেন এক্সচেঞ্জ পলিসি গাইডলাইন 89 যখন প্রথম হয়, তখন কিন্তু বাংলাদেশে 100% র মেটেরিয়ালস ইনপুট করতে হতো। ইভেন সুতা পর্যন্ত আমাদের ইম্পোর্ট করতে হতো। ওই সময়ের জন্য ওইটা ভ্যালিড ছিল, বাট এখন যখন আমি 100% লোকাল মেটেরিয়াল দ্বারা তৈরি পণ্য রপ্তানি করতে পারছি, তাহলে আমাকে কেন এখনো ওই ক্লজের আন্ডারে থাকতে হবে? এই জায়গাগুলি যেমন হচ্ছে না, এগুলি ঠিক করা দরকার। আর বাংলাদেশে ইতিহাসে এই প্রথম কন্টিনিউয়াস 7 মাস এক্সপোর্ট ডিক্লাইন করেছে। এর আগে এই 40-45 বছরে কোনোদিন কিন্তু কন্টিনিউয়াস 1-2 মাসের বেশি কখনো ডিক্লাইন করে না। তার মানে বুঝতে পারছেন যে আমরা কতটুকু বিপদে আছি। এবং আপনি দেখেন গত কয়েক বছর যাবত কোনো ইনভেস্টমেন্ট নাই, আমাদের কোনো এক্সপানশন নাই। আপনার কন্টিনিউয়াস আমাদের সকল প্রকার এক্সপেন্ডিচার বেড়েছে, কিন্তু আমার ডলার যদি ডিভ্যালুয়েট না হয় তাহলে আমি এটা রিজার্ভ করবো। তো সেই জায়গাটা, আর এইভাবে যখন আমার কন্টিনিউয়াস যখন ডিক্লাইন করছে এবং আগামী জুন পর্যন্ত ডিক্লাইন করবে, আমাদের কাছে যে ফোরকাস্ট আছে তাতে আমরা মনে করছি যে এরপরে মানে পজিটিভ ধারায় ফিরবে কিনা রপ্তানি, এখনো পর্যন্ত ওরকম কোনো পূর্বাভাস নেই। বাইরের কাছ থেকে আমরা এখনো কোনো রকম পাচ্ছি না। তো এই জায়গাতে আমরা আরো যেটা এলডিসি গ্রাজুয়েশন নিয়ে যেটা আমি শুরু থেকে কথা বলেছি, কন্টিনিউয়াস আগের সরকারও বলেছি, এই ইন্টারিম গভর্নমেন্টের সময় প্রথম যেদিন আমরা উপদেষ্টার সাথে দেখা করি, প্রধান উপদেষ্টার সাথে জুলাই অগাস্ট 20 তারিখ 2024 সালের অগাস্টের 20 তারিখ ওনাকে প্রথম আমার বক্তব্যটাই ছিল এলডিসি গ্রাজুয়েশন পিছানো। কন্টিনিউয়াসলি বলার পর এটা করেনি, গভর্নমেন্ট এটা করেছেন, সেই জন্য আমি ধন্যবাদ জানাই। আমরা যখন গত মাসের 4 তারিখ জানুয়ারি মাসের 4 তারিখ প্রথম যখন বর্তমান প্রধানমন্ত্রীর সাথে আমরা দেখা করি, সেদিন আমি 2টা জিনিস উত্থাপন করেছিলাম, এলডিসি গ্রাজুয়েশন আর লেবার ল সমস্যা। তো উনি দুটোই আমার সাথে এগ্রি করেছিলেন এবং বলেছিলেন উনি যে আমরা যদি দায়িত্বে আসি তাহলে এলডিসি গ্রাজুয়েশন পিছাবো, এবং ওনারা দায়িত্ব নিয়েই কিন্তু এটা করেছে, সেই জন্য ধন্যবাদ। এখন প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে এলডিসি গ্রাজুয়েশন পিছনে যদি হয়, এরপরে এখনো পর্যন্ত সরকারের দিক থেকে কোন রোডম্যাপ তৈরির কোন মিটিং বা তাগাদা কোনো কিছু না। আগের সরকারও করেনি, এর আগের সরকারও করে। তো এই জায়গাগুলো আমার মনে হয় কাজ করে দরকার। ইন্ডিয়া, আপনারা জানেন ইন্ডিয়া রিসেন্টলি এফটি করেছে ইউরোপিয়ান ইউনিয়নের সাথে, বাট আমরা ভিয়েতনাম করে ফেলেছি। আমাদের মেইন কম্পিটিটরস কিন্তু দুইটাই, ইন্ডিয়া এবং ভিয়েতনাম। এখন আমরা কিন্তু এই জায়গায় এখন কোনো উদ্যোগী নেই। তো এই জায়গাগুলি কাজ করা দরকার, আদারওয়াইজ এই ভালনারেবিলিটি আরো কিন্তু বেড়ে যাবে আমাদের ইন্ডাস্ট্রি, এবং এগুলো আরো অনেক সমস্যা আমাদেরকে ফেস করতে হবে। সর্বশেষ আমি একটা কথা বলে শেষ করি, যেটা আমি এর আগেও প্রায় বলে যাচ্ছি, এর আগে মাসুরিয়াজের উপস্থিত অনেক কথা এই জিনিসগুলি এনবিআর এর বিশেষ করে ট্যাক্সেশন পলিসি নিয়ে আমি বলেছি। বাংলাদেশে এখনো পর্যন্ত এই ট্যাক্সেশন পলিসিটা বিনিয়োগ এবং ব্যবসার পরিপন্থী, এবং এটা আশ্চর্যজনক ভাবে আমরা দেখে যাচ্ছি, কিছু করতে পারছি না। যে আমাদেরকে মানে ট্যাক্সের মেইন যে স্পিরিট, যে আমি প্রফিট করবো, প্রফিটের উপর ট্যাক্স, কিন্তু এখন আমাদের কাছে নিচ্ছি সেলের উপর ট্যাক্স। আমি প্রফিট করি আর লস করি, আমার ওই সেলের উপর ট্যাক্স দিয়ে যাচ্ছে, এবং সেটাকে কোথাও কোনোভাবে অ্যাডজাস্ট করছে না। ইভেন আমি যেটা আরো বলতে চাই, যে বছর শেষে আমাদের যে ব্যালেন্স শিটটা তৈরি করি, রিটার্ন ট্যাক্স রিটার্নে কমপ্লিট করি, সেটাও আমাদেরকে ফেক এবং ফলস বানাইতে হয়। কারণ ওই এনবিআর যে ট্যাক্সটা আমার কাছ থেকে এআইটি হিসেবে নিয়ে গেল, সেটাকে ট্যাক্সেবল ফিগার করার জন্য আমার প্রফিট কত বানাইতে হয়, ক্যালকুলেশন করে আমাকে ওই প্রফিটে যাইতে হয়, ব্যালেন্স শিট দিয়ে ওইটাকে দিতে হয়। এটা একটা এনবিআর, তার মানে আমাদেরকে এনবিআর বাধ্য করতেছে এই ফেক এবং ফলস ব্যালেন্স শিট বানাই। আবার বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংক, আমি যে এক্সপোর্ট আমদানি রপ্তানি কার্যক্রম করছি, আমাকে যে ফ্যাসিলিটি দিচ্ছে, এই ফ্যাসিলিটিটা বন্ধ হয়ে যাবে যদি আমার ওই ব্যালেন্স শিটে যদি ওরকম মিনিমাম 60% পয়েন্ট আমি যদি মানে প্রফিট করে 61 পয়েন্ট আর্ন করতে না পারি, তাহলে আমার ওই পরদিন থেকে আমার সব বন্ধ হয়ে যাবে। তো এই যে বিষয়গুলি, এইগুলি আমার মনে হয় আমাদের এক্সপোর্টের জন্য অনেকগুলি বাধা। আমি অনেক বলেছি, বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকের রেগুলার বলেছি যে বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকের বিশেষ করে লাস্ট গভর্নর যিনি ছিলেন, আমরা অত্যন্ত একজন শ্রদ্ধাভাজন ব্যক্তি, আমি খুব ওনাকে লাইক করি, পছন্দ করি, এবং ওনার বেশ কিছু জায়গায় উনি সফল হয়েছে। বিশেষ করে যে লুটপাটটা যেটা হচ্ছিল, এটাকে কন্ট্রোলে নিয়ে আসছে, এটা বন্ধ করতে পেরেছেন। দ্বিতীয়ত যে ইনফ্লেশনটাকে ওনারা কন্ট্রোল করেছেন। তৃতীয়ত ডলার যে ক্রাইসিস ছিল সেটাকেও করেছেন। কিন্তু যেই জায়গাটাতে আমি কন্টিনিউয়াস বলেছি যে আমার ইন্ডাস্ট্রি আইসিতে আছে সেখান থেকে বের করতে হবে, সেই জায়গাটাতে ওই ইন্ডাস্ট্রিকে বের করে আনার জন্য প্রপার যে ট্রিটমেন্টটা দরকার, যে পলিসি দরকার, সেটা বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংক দিতে ব্যর্থ হয়েছে। কারণ কারণ আমি যেটা মনে করছি যে কারণ আমার মনে হচ্ছে যে আমরা প্র্যাকটিক্যাল ফিল্ডে যে জায়গাগুলি সমস্যা ফেস করছি এগুলি অনেক বলার পরেও ওই জায়গাগুলিকে কোনো রেকটিফাই করেন নাই। ফলে আপনি দেখেন গত 1-1.5 বছরে অন্তত আমাদের বিকেএমই এবং বিজেপি 300-র উপরে ফ্যাক্টরি কিন্তু বন্ধ হয়ে গেছে। আরো ফ্যাক্টরি বন্ধ হওয়ার পথে। নন পারফর্মিং লোনের কথা বললেন যে 30% গিয়ে উঠেছে। তো এটা তো আগের সরকারের সময় ব্যাংকগুলি হাইড করে না, যার কারণে এটা আসছে। কিন্তু এখন যেটা হচ্ছে বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকের এই রং পলিসির কারণে বহু ইন্ডাস্ট্রি বন্ধ হয়ে গেলে তার ইয়েটাও কিন্তু নন পারফর্মিং লোনের সাথে অ্যাড হয়ে যাবে, কন্টিনিউয়াসলি কিন্তু এটা বাড়তেছে। এই জায়গা নিয়ে আমার মনে হয় আপনারা একটু যদি কথা বলে আইডেন্টিফাই করে দেন, বিশেষ করে আপনারা যারা অর্থনীতির বিদ আছেন আপনারা কথা বললে হয়তো বা এই জায়গাগুলি আইডেন্টিফাই করে দিলে এই রেকটিফাই করতে পারে। তা আজকে আমাকে এখানে আমাকে আপনারা যে দাওয়াত দিয়ে গেছেন, প্রধান অতিথির দায়িত্ব দিয়েছেন, আন্তরিকভাবে আমি আপনাদেরকে ধন্যবাদ এবং কৃতজ্ঞতা জানাচ্ছি। আমি অনেক বছর যাবত এই সেক্টরকে নিয়ে কাজ করছি। আমার জীবনের মানে বৃহৎ সময়টাই আমি আমার নিজের জন্য ব্যয় করি না, আমি ডেডিকেটেড করে রেখেছি এই সেক্টরের জন্য। বাংলাদেশের বিশেষ করে রপ্তানি খাতের জন্য আমি দীর্ঘদিন কাজ করছি। যতদিন আছে ইনশাল্লাহ কাজ করে যাব আপনাদের সহযোগিতা।
আমরাও কাজ করছি,
আপনারাও কাজ করছেন, আপনাদের সহযোগিতা আমরা চাই সবসময়। ধন্যবাদ।
ধন্যবাদ হাতেম সাহেব, আপনি খুব সুন্দরভাবে প্র্যাকটিক্যাল কথাগুলো বলেছেন যেগুলো ইন্ডাস্ট্রি ফেস করছে, এবং এখানে অনেক বেশ কিছু ইস্যুস আছে, রেগুলেটরি ইস্যুস আছে, ট্যাক্সের ব্যাপারে বললেন। বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকেরও ডিরেগুলেশন দরকার, ফরেন এক্সচেঞ্জ পলিসিটা অত্যন্ত পুরোপুরি এবং এটা নট কন্ডিউসিভ টু দ্য প্রেজেন্ট এনভায়রনমেন্ট। I think we have come to a conclusion for this session, and unless anybody wants to have last say or any intervention. If not,
last time we have chairman.
I think Dr. Khurshid has advised me that you would prefer not to.
আমার কাছে যদি কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে সেটার উত্তর
গভর্নমেন্ট সেদিন পাঠাচ্ছে না ফর ফ্রি ট্রেড টু স্টার্ট দিস নেগোসিয়েশন, চিঠি অলরেডি পাঠিয়েছে
EU
আর ভিয়েতনাম কিন্তু করে
না, it takes time. India took 30 years.
একটু হাতেম সাহেবকে প্রশ্ন করতে যাচ্ছি, যদি আপনি এম্বারাস ফিল না করেন।
আমি কখনো এম্বারাস ফিল করি না। আমি
with regard to export of your products domestically, এই গভর্নমেন্ট পলিসি বাদ দিয়ে কাদের কাছ থেকে আপনারা বেশি অপোজিশন বা থ্রেট বা ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং ফেস করছেন?
না, আমরা কাদের কাছ থেকে অপোজিশন বলতে আমরা আমি যেটা প্রায় বলি, আমি ইউরোপিয়ান ইউনিয়নের অ্যাম্বাসেডরকে বলেছিলাম যে তোমাদের ডিউ ডিলিজেন্স লটা ডিফেক্টিভ। এটা কেন ডিফেক্টিভ? তোমরা আমাকে 7টা এরিয়াকে মনিটরিং করবা বলছো, কিন্তু তুমি কোথাও এই কথা বলো নাই যে তোমার ব্র্যান্ড এবং বায়াররা আমাকে ইথিক্যাল প্রাইস দিচ্ছে কিনা, ফেয়ার প্রাইস দিচ্ছে কিনা। আমাদের রপ্তানি খাতের সবচেয়ে বড় প্রতিবন্ধকতার মধ্যে এটাই যে বায়াররা আমাদেরকে ইথিক্যাল প্রাইস দিচ্ছে, ফেয়ার প্রাইস দিচ্ছে না। যার ফলে আপনি দেখেন কন্টিনিউয়াসলি আমার সবকিছু প্রাইস যেখানে বাড়ছে, আমি একটা আইটেম কন্টিনিউয়াসলি লাস্ট অনেক বছর যাবত করতেছি, একটা বড় ব্র্যান্ডের। গত বছর আমাকে পার পিস $1.54 দিয়েছে। এই বছর যেখানে বাড়ার কথা পাচ্ছেন সেখানে আমাকে 4 সেন্ট কমিয়ে দিয়েছে পার পিস। তো আমি এটা নিয়ে অনেক যুদ্ধ করার পর আমি বলছি না, তাহলে আমি কাজ করবো।
দেখি হাতেম ভাই H-Red ল যেটা হয়েছে, হিউম্যান রাইটস এন্ড এনভায়রনমেন্টাল ডিউ ডিলিজেন্স, ওই লটা H-Red যেটা,
ইউরোপিয়ান যে ডিউ ডিলিজেন্স ঠিক আছে। তো এই জায়গাটাতে আমরা ফেস করি। আরেকটা যেটা ফেস করি, লোকালি আমরা অনেক কথা বলি সরকারের সাথে, অনেক জায়গায় অনেক প্রতিবন্ধকতা আছে যেগুলি নিয়ে আমরা রেগুলার কথা বলি, কিন্তু এগুলির মানে এত স্লো, যতক্ষণে গিয়ে দেখা যায় এটা রেক্টিফাই, ততক্ষণে মানে ওই চ্যাপ্টার ক্লোজ হয়ে গেছে।
বিকেএমই প্রোডাক্টসে মানে নিটওয়্যার প্রোডাক্টসে আপনার ম্যাক্সিমাম ভ্যালু এডিশন হচ্ছে কম্পেয়ার টু the product of the RGM, sorry. এক্ষেত্রে আপনারা যে ধরনের সাপোর্ট পাওয়ার উচিত ছিল সেটা আপনারা পাচ্ছেন
না।
কিন্তু এই যে পাচ্ছেন না তার পেছনে কোনো মেকানিজম আপনারা আবিষ্কার করতে পেরেছেন কিনা বা দেখতে পেরেছেন কিনা বা জানেন কিনা?
না, এটা জটিলতা। এক নম্বর হচ্ছে আমলাতান্ত্রিক জটিলতা। আপনি দেখেন মানে এই যে উনি রিফর্মের কথা বলছেন, এই রিফর্মটা খুব জরুরি। যদি রিফর্মটা না হয় তাহলে এই প্রতিবন্ধকগুলি চলতে থাকবে। আপনি দেখেন এই যে আমি ওই যে আমদানি নীতি আদেশে ওই যে বন্ড লাইসেন্স থাকতে হবে ইয়ের জন্য, ম্যাট্রিক্যালসির জন্য, এই পয়েন্টটা আমি রেজ করছি আরো অনেক আগে। আজ থেকে ধরেন 3-4 বছর আগে এটা কমিটি মানে প্রস্তাবনা দিয়ে রেখেছে, আনএনিমাস ডিসিশন হয়েছে যে এটাকে রেকটিফাই করতে হবে। বাণিজ্য মন্ত্রণালয়ের এডিশনাল সেক্রেটারি নেতৃত্বে কমিটি, সেই কমিটি রিপোর্ট দেওয়ার পরে বাণিজ্য মন্ত্রণালয় আজও এখনো পর্যন্ত এটাকে রেকটিফাই করে তার কাছে বলবে না।
আমার একটা প্রশ্ন ছিল আপনার কাছে, আমি রাখি বেকার টেলিভিশন। আপনি বলছিলেন যে এনপিআর আপনাদেরকে বাধ্য করছে ভুয়া ব্যালেন্স শিট তৈরি করার জন্য। এই জিনিসটা আসলে কতদিন ধরে হচ্ছে? আপনারা 40 বছরের বেশি সময় ধরে আসলে এক্সপোর্ট করছেন?
এটা লাস্ট 3-4 ইয়ার্স,
কেন 3-4 বছর?
হ্যাঁ, মানে আগে যেমন আমি এখানে বলি আমাদের কর্পোরেট ট্যাক্স রেট কিন্তু 12%। এটা একটা ভুয়া জিনিস। কারণ হচ্ছে আমার যখন তুমি 1 কোটি টাকা একটা ট্যাক্স নিয়ে গেল, নিয়ে আমাকে কোথাও অ্যাডজাস্ট করলে না, তাহলে পরে এটা কত পার্সেন্টে পড়বে? তাও 100%, কোথাও 200%। মানে আমি যদি লসে থাকি তাহলে এটা কোনো পার্সেন্টেজই পাবো।
এই প্রক্রিয়া কি এখনো চলমান আছে?
এখনো চলমান আছে।
এআইটি নিচ্ছে না
মানে লস করলো দিয়ে পেইং। হ্যাঁ,
কতটুকু আমাদের জন্য বেদনাদায়ক। আমি মনে করি আমার তো 1 কোটি টাকা নিয়ে 1 কোটি টাকা নিয়ে গেল ট্যাক্স, মনে করি ওখানে ট্যাক্স হয়েছে 12% ট্যাক্স, যদি বলি 12 লাখ টাকা ট্যাক্স নিচে 1 কোটি, ওখানে 88 লক্ষ টাকা বেশি দিচ্ছে। এখন আমার অন্যান্য জায়গায় আমার কিছু ট্যাক্স ধরতেছে, যেমন ধরেন আমার যদি লিমিটেড কোম্পানি না হয়ে ওটা প্রপার্টিশিপ কনসার্ন, তাহলে ওই যে 1 কোটি টাকা নিচে ওইটার উপর আমার 30% সারচার্জ, তার মানে 30 লাখ। ওই 30 লাখ আমাকে জমা দিতে হবে। আমি জমা না দিলে পরে ওই আমার রিটার্ন থাকলে আমি করতে পারি। এগুলো তো একটা জুলুম, অত্যাচার। এই জুলুম চলছে।
শেষ করার আগে একটা
But interesting.
I think we have approached the closing of this. Dr. Khurshid Alam has decided that he will not make closing statements. I'll turn to
I'll still make one point because
you make your point and also close.
Okay. উনি যেটা বলেছেন যে ওনাদের এই যে এনবিআর যে ট্যাক্স করে, ওনাদের সেলস এর উপরে ট্যাক্স করে, ওনাদের ট্যাক্স করার পর ট্যাক্সের প্রিন্সিপাল হচ্ছে মানে ইনডাইরেক্ট ট্যাক্স, কর্পোরেট ট্যাক্স, এটা হচ্ছে প্রফিট। তো আমরা এই যে টাস্ক ফোর্স ফর ট্যাক্স পলিসি রিফর্ম যেটা করা হয়েছিল ইন দ্য ইন্টারিম গভর্নমেন্ট, আমাদের ট্যাক্স পলিসি রিপোর্টে কিন্তু এই বিষয়টা পরিষ্কার করে বলা আছে যে ট্যাক্স শুড বি অন প্রফিট, নট অন সেল। সো দিস পয়েন্ট ইজ বিট। বাকি যেটা ডিপ রিফর্ম, এই যে আমাদের প্রেজেন্টেশনে যেটা বলা হচ্ছে ডিপ রিফর্ম, যেগুলো জায়গায় দুটো জায়গায় তো জরুরি দরকার আছে। একটা হচ্ছে ব্যাংকিং সেক্টর, আর একটা হচ্ছে ন্যাশনাল বোর্ড অফ রেভিনিউ ট্যাক্স সিস্টেমে। ট্যাক্স সিস্টেম কারেন্টলি is in a mess, এবং বিশেষ করে আমি তো ফোকাস অন দ্য ট্রেড ট্যাক্স পার্ট, কিন্তু ডিরেক্ট ট্যাক্স এবং ভ্যাটেও মানে প্রচুর মেস আছে। এগুলো ক্লিয়ার করার জন্য ডিপ রিফর্ম দরকার হবে, এবং সেই জন্য এই যে আপনারা আশা করছি যে নতুন যে মানে ইলেক্টেড গভর্নমেন্ট আছে, ইলেক্টেড গভর্নমেন্ট, ডেমোক্রেটিক গভর্নমেন্ট অ্যাকচুয়ালি এই ক্রাইসিসের পরে কিন্তু রিফর্ম, ডিপ রিফর্ম করতে পারে। অ্যাটলিস্ট 1991 আমরা সেটা দেখেছি যে বিএনপি গভর্নমেন্ট ডিপ রিফর্ম করতে পেরেছিল, ইকোনমির একদম ডিরেকশন চেঞ্জ করতে পেরেছিল। আমরা এখন আশা করছি যে they will go into these deep reform, এবং ট্রেড পলিসি পার্টে ডিপ রিফর্ম না হলে কিন্তু এই যে এতগুলো যে এগ্রিমেন্টের কথা বললাম, এগুলো সুবিধা করতে পারবে না। এগুলোর জন্যই কিছু ডিপ রিফর্ম আশা করছি।
প্রিভিয়াস ট্যাক্স, সরি ফর দ্যাট, প্রশ্ন না, এমনি বাইরে বলছি। আমাদের যে ফিনান্স অ্যাডভাইজার ছিলেন প্রিভিয়াস, ইমিডিয়েটলি, উনি কিন্তু কিছু রিকমেন্ডেশন, ঠিক বলবো না, কিছু কি বলা হয়, নোট টু দ্য সাকসেসর যাকে আমরা বলি আর কি, থুয়ে গেছে। আমার কি ওটা পড়ার সৌভাগ্য বা দুর্ভাগ্য হয়েছে আর কি। জি জি, বলছি
ইমপ্লিমেন্ট করার সময় পান।
করেছে এখানে বেশ অনেকগুলো যে এই গভর্নমেন্টে আসলে এই কাজগুলি করা উচিত। এখন যদি অ্যাকর্ডিং টু হিজ ওন ভার্সন এই জিনিসগুলি যদি করে তাহলে গভর্নমেন্ট যদি সেটা করে তাহলে থিংস উইল বি স্ট্রিমলাইন ফার্দার, অনেক স্ট্রিমলাইন হবে, যেটা এই হাতেম সাহেব বললেন আর কি, অনেকখানি হবে। আর যদি না করে তাহলে তো বলার কিচ্ছু নাই। এখন পয়েন্টটা তো এখানে যে পলিটিক্যাল গভর্নমেন্ট এটা করবে কি করবে না, আমি এই জন্যই প্রশ্ন করেছিলাম সেখানে। এই জিনিসগুলি তো পলিটিক্যাল গভর্নমেন্টের পক্ষে করা খুব কঠিন, অথচ ইট ইজ ট্রু মেজর যে কোনো ডিসিশন কিন্তু নেওয়ার জন্য পলিটিক্যাল গভর্নমেন্ট অলমোস্ট আইডিয়াল।
এবং ওনারা করেছেন 1991-এ ওনারা করেছেন, এবং ট্যাক্স রিফর্ম ইজ বিগ আইটেম।
তখন ইউ আর অ্যাবসলিউটলি রাইট, সাইফুর রহমানের মতন একজন লোক ছিল, সরি আমি বেঁচে মারা গেছেন,
তখন সাইফুর রহমান সাহেব ছিলেন ওই কারণে।
I think we have reached the end of the discussion. Thank you all for coming and participating in this very engaging and thoughtful workshop. I think there are lots of food for thought, but we have to give the new government the time because they just have come in.
Yeah.
They are getting their act together. We are hoping that we'll see some positive changes in the program, and all this will go as a right. With that, we close you again. Okay. We close this. Thank you.
At least first 100 days for that.